What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with a 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though, guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I used to work night shift security, and by far the scariest thing I had ever encountered was when I chanced upon a robbery in progress. I was patrolling one of our assets around the start of my shift at 10 p.m., walking around the perimeter of the building. Everything looked to be in order, except for an air conditioner near ground level that had seemingly fallen out of place. The air conditioner didn't fit well in the hole, so there had been a wooden plank to prop it up and keep it there. I assumed the stick holding it up had somehow gotten nudged, and the AC unit had fallen out of place on its own. It wasn't very heavy, so I propped it back into its hole in the wall, positioning the stick to keep it in place once more. I continued my walk around the building, reaching the next window, when to my surprise I saw someone there. The light in the room wasn't on, but there was a bit of light entering from the hallway. It wasn't uncommon for a worker to be working late on a project, or using their code to re-enter the building and grab something they'd forgotten earlier. I pressed my face to the glass to see who it was, and if I would recognize them. Once I was peering through the glass, though, I could make out that it definitely was not an office worker. The person was wearing a ski mask over their face. They noticed my own face pressed up against the window and hustled out of the room. Realizing that a robbery was in progress, I quickly put 2 and 2 together, figuring out that the fallen air conditioning unit hole was most likely the way they had entered the building. I immediately pressed a button on my phone in an app that my company used to notify the police. I was still standing only about 100 feet away from the AC unit, so I ran over to see if that's how the perpetrator would attempt to escape. Sure enough, shortly after I reached the area, the AC unit came flying out at me as the intruder kicked it out forcefully from the inside. The AC unit knocked straight backward into my chest, and I watched as the person in the ski mask escaped through the hole in the wall. He barreled right into me and the AC unit that I'd somehow managed to catch. The suspect ran into a nearby neighborhood, but the police arrived soon after and had them cornered on a city block. They shut down the entire street and eventually captured them. It felt good to say I had stopped an attempted robbery in progress, but I'll never forget the image of that person flying out through that dark hole in the wall directly into me. It was quite terrifying, and I had nightmares about it for the next couple of nights afterward. I worked at a hotel for many years when I was younger. I eventually got promoted and earned better pay and shift hours, but when I was first working there, I was constantly on the night shift. The night shift was from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and the only workers in the entire building would be me and another person working at the front desk check-in area. The hotel was not a 5-star hotel by any means, but it was fairly nice. Most people we encountered and checked in the middle of the night weren't problematic at all. One night at about 2 a.m. though, a grumpy-looking middle-aged man came in, asking for a hotel room for the night. We got him set up with his room, and then asked for the payment before giving him his room keys. He informed us that he was not able to pay currently, but he would pay us before he left in the morning. Well, we clearly were not allowed to do that, so we informed him that he could either pay for his room right now, or he wouldn't be allowed to stay here. The man got quite angry and proceeded to cuss us out. The other guy I was working with that night, who was much more confrontational than I am, stepped out from behind the desk, telling the man to leave or he'd make him do so. I was just about ready to call the police, when all of a sudden the man just took off running into the hotel down the hallway. Both of us workers jogged out after him to see him entering the stairway and head downstairs toward the hotel's basement. The hotel's basement was already creepy enough as it was, being much older than the rest of the hotel and having a bunch of storage stacked high everywhere. My coworker wanted me to go down there with him, but I said it was already creepy enough without the possibility of a crazy man lurking somewhere behind all that storage. Instead, I called the police, and they came to search the basement. They found the man hiding in the storage area with a knife in his hand. Luckily, they were able to detain him without anybody getting hurt. I'm so glad I didn't let my coworker talk me into us going down there. Who knows what the man would have done if it had only been us two to find him with that knife, instead of a group of armed and trained police officers. We didn't get any more shady characters like that during the entire time I was on the night shift there. Still, after that encounter, I did feel a bit relieved when I got promoted and was able to work more regular hours during the daytime. I had a really crazy situation when I was shopping at Walmart just a few weeks ago. I went there sort of late at night to buy a couple of things. I didn't really want to go, but I knew it would be busy the next day, so I drove down. Thankfully, it's not too far away from my place. I parked my car in the parking lot, which was much more empty than I'd been expecting. I parked sort of on the side, but still in front of the store. I got out of my car and walked through the parking lot to go in. When I did, though, I noticed there was this one random car parked a little closer to the store than I was. As I passed by it, I noted there were at least 3 people inside currently, and that the vehicle was running. Aside from that, I didn't really pay it much attention, though. I went inside of Walmart and walked around the store, shopping and grabbing the things I needed. It really was dead inside, and so I was able to shop fairly quickly. It probably took me less than 5 minutes to grab everything I needed. I went up to the self-checkout and paid for everything, then left and walked out of the Walmart to go back to my vehicle. At this point, though, not long after I'd made it out of the store, I noticed something strange. There was a man at my car, and the passenger side door was open. He was looking inside my vehicle. I didn't know how this happened or why, but I started running over to my car. I yelled at the man, asking him what he was doing, and saying that was my vehicle. Once I'd got about halfway there, he stopped and looked right at me, then took off running in another direction. I reached my car and saw the man running to the other car that had been running in the parking lot. He got inside the back seat, and the car quickly squealed away. I went around and got into my car. I looked over and saw my glove box as well as the center console were open. There were random things on the floor in the passenger seat, which had been in them, but I didn't really have anything that valuable in my car. I got inside and was just about to call the police when I suddenly heard a noise from behind me. I looked back, and there was another man in the back seat of my vehicle on the passenger side. He had been ducked down, hidden from my sight. When I saw him, I opened my door and left running all the way to the Walmart front doors. I called the police and watched the car from there. At first, the man made no attempt to leave. After maybe a minute or so, though, he opened up the back door and sprinted away to the side of the Walmart building, out of my view at that point. Eventually, I walked back out of the Walmart and went to my car again. This time I checked for any more hidden people, and luckily there was no one else. I locked the doors and waited for the cops to arrive in the meantime. While I was waiting, I was constantly observing my surroundings. I noticed that at one point at the side of the parking lot, I saw the man emerge again. He was really far away and walking toward my car. At that point, the car I'd seen before entered the parking lot, going blazingly fast. It stopped right out front, and the man who had been inside my car jumped inside of it. The car then sped away once more. The tires squealed all the while. After it left, they quickly went out of my sight. The police arrived just a few moments later, and I told them everything I could, giving a description of the man as well as their vehicle. After that, I went home, and I don't know if those men ever were located. I used to work at a Walmart supercenter several years ago. I only worked there for about 6 months, if that. My job was really just stocking shelves, and I often worked really late at night after the store had closed. It was a job that was fairly easy, so I didn't really mind it that much. One time I was working though, and the store hadn't quite closed yet. Still, I was stocking the shelves in the back middle of the store. It was normally a really quiet area, and so I was all by myself. About 30 minutes had gone by, and I hadn't seen anybody at all at that point. I put in some headphones, which I did all the time, since the store was closing in about 10 minutes or so. I was now listening to my music, stocking the shelves. Not long after this, though, I could sense that somebody was behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw this woman just kinda standing there. She was wearing this really creepy-looking mask over her face, but it wasn't covering her entire head, just a portion of her face including her eyes. It really freaked me out at first, especially with the music in my ears, so I hadn't heard her approaching at all. She was about 20 feet away from me. I took my headphones out and did a little laugh, realizing it was probably a prank or something. I jokingly said the woman had scared me, but instead of laughing along, the woman just stood there and didn't say anything at all. I asked her if I could help her with something, but she still didn't say anything. After another awkward moment or two, I said I was going to get back to work. I did so a few moments later, and I looked back and saw the woman was now gone. It was a very strange occurrence, but I figured it was just somebody trying to get a reaction out of me. I continued with my work for about an hour or so. I was just working like normal by myself in that area. I moved a couple of aisles over, but I was still in the general location. Everything was still very quiet. All of a sudden, I remember I randomly turned around again and saw the woman was back now. This was really weird because we were currently closed at the moment. We had been for well over an hour now. I couldn't believe that I was seeing her once more. She was just standing there like before. I asked the woman what the hell she was doing here. The store was closed. She couldn't be here. Of course, the woman didn't say anything at all. All of a sudden, she picked up a random item off the shelf and threw it at me. It hit me right in the head. I stood up and she picked up something else. She began to throw that at me too. I didn't know what was going on. She began to pelt me with items. I left out the back way and walked quickly to try and find another coworker. As I did this, I heard the woman chasing after me. I ran to the front of the store, and at that point I seemed to have lost her. I found my manager and told her about the woman. She radioed to somebody else. Before I knew it, the police got called. They entered the store and searched for the woman. Apparently, this lady had also assaulted another coworker. Eventually, the police were able to locate her and get her to leave. After that, we all went back to work. But that was by far my craziest experience working at Walmart. For some background, I'm a woman. I was a junior in high school at the time of this story, and the school I went to was fairly large. It had lots of other students attending. I would say that I had a decent amount of friends, and my locker was near several of them. Each grade kind of had their lockers clumped together in a certain area. The juniors were in a large locker common area near the science department, sort of at one end of the school. The story really begins one day when I was at my locker in between classes. None of my friends were around at that time, and there was a little space between me and everybody else. It would get extremely crowded during some times of the day there, so much so that it was hard to even open the lockers sometimes. It was nice that it wasn't so busy currently. At that point, though, I noticed there was this guy standing near my locker. I had never seen him before and wasn't sure where he'd even come from. I assumed that he must be a senior, because he looked to be older than me. He approached me when I was at my locker and said hello. He proceeded to start a conversation with me and asked me to skip class and leave school with him, asking if we could hang out. I didn't even know this guy, and I took school very seriously. I did not want to skip for any reason. I told him no, I had to go to class. I said he should be doing the same thing. He asked me to hang out with him after school then, and I still said no. I was busy, but really I didn't want to hang out with this random person at all. I was not interested. I left the guy and said I had to go now. He was still lingering at my locker as I walked away. For the rest of the school day, I didn't see him at all, but the next day he was right back there. I got done with my class and went to my locker, only to find him there waiting in front of it. He was kind of blocking my way. I asked him to move, and he started asking to hang out again. He knew my name somehow, even though I'd never met him before yesterday. I kept telling him I didn't want to. Luckily this time, some of my friends were around to help me. When he didn't move, several of them confronted him, and finally he did. After he left, I asked my friends who he was, but none of them knew anything about him. We all assumed that he was a senior, and I just hoped he would leave me alone. Later that day after school, I was stopping at my locker before going home. When I did, the very same guy was there. This time, though, he asked me if I needed a ride home. Of course, having dealt with him several times now, I immediately said no. I drove to and from school every day anyway. He still tried to convince me, but I just walked away from him and left. After this, I didn't see him for a while. Eventually, I found out that he didn't even go to our school. Apparently, he tried convincing several other girls to leave with him as well. One of them ended up reporting him for harassment after he apparently followed her into the restroom. That's when they found out he wasn't a student at all. Nobody really knew who he was until a week or two later. One of my friends showed me a news story online. It was an attempted kidnapping of a local woman. Luckily, she managed to get away. The man was caught, though, and I saw it was that very same guy. Turns out he was 23 years old and not even in school at all. Not college or high school. No wonder he looked older. I really couldn't believe it. I feel grateful that everybody ended up being all right in the end, and that the man was caught without being able to do any damage. I used to walk to and from school every day. This was when I was in high school, and during my freshman and sophomore years. Obviously, I did not have my driver's license yet. I also didn't like to ride the bus. Luckily, we lived close enough that I could walk to school, and we lived in a warmer climate where the winters were very mild. It would take me about 15 minutes to arrive to school, and I really had no problem with that at all. We lived in a residential neighborhood, and I would take a couple of sidewalks to the high school. That was basically it. Most days, I would walk all by myself. At 7 o'clock in the morning, things were very quiet. The roads were not very busy, other than the occasional car passing by. One morning, I was walking to school like any other day. I would say that I was about halfway there when suddenly I heard a vehicle approaching me from behind. At this point, there had been a few cars here and there driving by, but I didn't really notice them. This car I did notice though, because it started driving much closer to me and slowed down like it was going to pull over. Surprisingly, it did just that. I looked over to this car, wondering who it was. The window rolled down, and there was a man I'd never seen before behind the wheel. He asked me if I could use a lift to class. Clearly, I knew better than to get a ride from this stranger. I said no. The man said something like it was probably a really long walk, but I still said no thanks. At that point, he actually did drive away. I walked the rest of the way, wondering if the man could have been dangerous or if he was just trying to be nice. Still, he should know better than to offer random high school kids rides. After school that day, I was walking back home. This was the very same day, mind you. I was by myself on the sidewalk. As I was nearing my neighborhood, but still a few minutes away, a car approached again. I didn't really pay attention right away, but I soon noticed it was the same one from earlier. The car slowed down and went about as slow as I was walking. Once more, the man rolled down the window. When I looked over, I saw it was the same guy. He asked me if I needed a ride again. I told him no, I did not need any rides, especially not from him. He said okay and drove off. I couldn't believe that this guy had tried to get me into his car twice, and I also couldn't believe he had given up so easily. Obviously, I was hoping I would never see him again. That was not the case, though. The very next morning, I was walking to school. Looking back, it's easy to say I should have told somebody, and I should have took more precautions, but for some reason, being a young high schooler, I thought the man would not return. I figured he would have gotten the hint by now, and the previous day would be the only day I would ever see him. As I walked to school on this morning, I was about halfway there. I saw a car pass me by, which looked just like the man's car. I got a bad feeling immediately. To my surprise, the car just drove right past me. For a moment, I felt a bit relieved, but the car pulled over to the side of the road about 50 feet in front of me. This time, it completely pulled over and looked like he'd turned the engine off. I had a terrible feeling. It seemed as though the man may get out, so I quickly turned and went into a random person's front yard. The sun was still sort of rising, so it was mostly dark out. I went into the neighbor's backyard and cut through a few more properties. I knew the area really well. I continued to cut through more people's yards and take random streets until I was able to make it all the way to school. I did not see the man or his car for the rest of the way there. This time when I got to school, I called my mom and told her about it right away. I also told all my school friends throughout the day. Everybody was quite concerned for me and said I should not walk home. My mom was working and offered to leave her job early, but I was able to get a ride with my friend Amanda. After school, I rode on Amanda's bus with her and went to her house after. The bus didn't go to my house because we had told the school that I was not going to be using it, so I wasn't assigned to a bus at all. My mom picked me up from Amanda's, and we contacted the school so I could take the bus after that. I stopped walking and rode the bus to and from school every day for the rest of the time until I was able to get my driver's license. From then on, I drove there for the rest of my high school career. Luckily, I never did see that man again. This happened back sometime in the very early 2000s. During this time, I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment that I had recently moved into. I was aware of a few of my neighbors, but not too many of them. The building seemed to have people moving in and out quite often. It was a larger apartment building that had a giant parking lot next to it, where all the residents parked. The apartment itself was pretty old and not the nicest, but it was pretty alright. After a few months of living there, I remember that one night, I heard this weird pounding noise coming from the next apartment over. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but I knew for sure it was my next-door neighbor. The noise went on and off as it got later and later. Soon, I was trying to sleep, but the sounds kept going. I had a hard time falling asleep because of it, and eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to go over there. I really didn't want to, but I was left no choice. I walked over and knocked on the door. After a few moments, a man opened it. He was a fairly large guy, bald and wearing baggy clothes. He looked at me confused and slightly annoyed. I told him that I was trying to sleep, and I was hearing him doing something through the walls. I asked him if he was doing some work in there or something like that. The man said he was building a table of some kind. I guess that did make sense, but I asked if he could quiet down, because I couldn't sleep at all. The guy looked really annoyed, but said okay, then slammed the door right in my face. I felt really awkward after that, but it was almost midnight. I went back and the man did stop. I was finally able to get some sleep. The next I saw the guy was the very next day, though it was nighttime once again. I was about to go to sleep when out of nowhere I heard this really loud music coming from next door. It was the same guy's apartment. I rolled my eyes when I heard it. I just hoped it wouldn't last for very long. The walls in this apartment were pretty thin, so noise traveled easily. This music had to be going almost full blast, and it continued well past when I wanted to go to sleep. I didn't want to go over to his place for a second night in a row. I wondered if this was his way of getting back at me or something. I mean, he must have known he was being too loud. I tried my best to sleep, but I didn't have any earplugs. I tried covering my ears and stuff, but I just couldn't manage. After trying to fall asleep for over an hour, with the music still continuing, I realized that I had to go confront the man. I left my apartment and walked on over. After knocking on his door, though, he did not answer. I waited there for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, knocking several more times. Soon it was clear, though, that the man was not going to answer me. I headed back to my place. I went back inside, hoping the guy would eventually turn it off, or I could get some rest despite it. Just after making it back to my place, though, I heard a door open and close from the hallway. Moments later, I heard somebody trying to open my apartment door. Luckily, I had locked it right away when I got back in. That was a habit. This seemed strange, so I went over to check. The man was standing there. I did not want to open the door because I had a bad feeling. He remained there for a few moments, just standing and looking angry. Then he turned around and walked back to his place, with the loud music still playing. He did not turn it off. I don't even know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the music had been stopped at some point. After that, I reported the guy to the apartment complex, but I guess he moved out a short time later anyway. That was good, because at least I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore after that. That was the craziest memory of living in any apartment for me. My last apartment that I lived in was located in what was a pretty nice area. It was fairly close to the city, and nearby many businesses and parks. I enjoyed living there. My apartment was on the first floor of one of 3 buildings in the complex. My apartment had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, kitchen area, and a small dining room area. There was also a balcony that was good-sized. It was slightly elevated from the ground below. Beyond that, there was a large section of woods that I had a good view of. One night, I was at home by myself. It was around 9 p.m. or so, and I was chilling in my living room. That was when I began to hear some strange noises coming from outside. I first assumed them to be some neighbors who might be outside doing something, most likely the ones next door. The noises sounded so close, though. I was curious, so I decided to get up and look out my balcony window. The blinds were closed, so I couldn't see anything outside at all at the moment. Once I slid them open, I got the surprise of my life. I saw that there, standing out on my balcony, was a random man. I couldn't believe it. Instantly, my heart started racing. When the man noticed me, he darted out of my sight by going to the left. He was still on my balcony, but he was now out of view of the window. I had no idea who he was, or why he was out there. I moved away from the window, but kept watching to see what the man would do. He seemed to be staying right where he was hiding for quite a while. After a few minutes, I finally heard some more noise. I saw him moving away and leaving my balcony as he jumped down onto the ground. He ran off into the distance, eventually disappearing into the woods. Once that happened, I was both glad the man was gone, but also perplexed. I didn't know what he'd been doing out there, and why had he darted off into the woods to escape. I went out to the balcony where I didn't really have anything stored at all, just a few decorations here and there. It didn't look like anything was out of place. I looked around toward the wood area, but I couldn't see anything strange over there either. I went back inside and made sure the door was locked. I closed the blinds again and simply hoped the man would not return, but of course he did. It was later that night, about 2 hours later. I was just about to go to bed when I heard a knocking at the window of my sliding glass door to the balcony. I had a terrible feeling. I knew instantly that man was back. I laid there in silence for a while. Then a much louder knock came at the door. I heard the man begin trying to open it. I didn't hesitate anymore. I grabbed my phone and called 911. When I told the dispatcher what was going on, I was told the police were on their way. The man knocked again very loudly and tried to open the door even further. I could not see any of his actions because the blinds were currently closed. I certainly was not going to open them right now. I stayed as far away as I could. In fact, I went right by the front door, just in case the guy managed to break in through the window or something. He stopped banging eventually, and things went completely silent. I wondered if he had run off into the woods again. The police got there a short time later, and I told them what happened. They went to check out the balcony, but it seemed the man was not there any longer. The police also went into the woods and checked those out as well. Surprisingly, they actually found the man hiding in there, the very same guy. When questioned, he tried to run, but he was caught. He refused to say anything, though. I'm not exactly sure what his intentions were, if he was trying to break in or what, but I'm glad the police caught him. This happened about 5 years ago. I was working, and it was around 12 p.m., right around time for my lunch break. I worked in an office building right near the city. From my job, there were a few places I could go to get some food. Sometimes I would also bring my own lunch. On this day, however, I decided to walk down over to Subway, about a 5-minute walk there from my building, so it was very convenient. I went there all the time. All I had to do was walk down the sidewalk, turn and go down another one for a very short distance, and I'd be right there. On this day, when I got inside the Subway, I noticed there was a very long line. I considered going someplace else, but I decided not to. Most places would be pretty busy around this time. Many people just like me were on their lunch breaks as well, so I stood there and hoped the line would move quickly. As the line moved, more people entered the Subway, and it grew even further behind me. It was moving at a fairly decent rate, though. I remember once I had been inside for at least 5 minutes, I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. I was getting a phone call. I took my phone out to see who it was calling me, but when I looked, I didn't recognize the number at all. At that point, I put my phone back in my pocket. Just moments later, after the initial call ended, I felt my phone vibrate from receiving a text message. Once more, I took out my phone and looked down at it. At this point, it was nearing my turn to order. There were only about 2 or 3 people up ahead of me. When I looked at the text, it was from the same unknown number that had just called me. It simply said, "I'm here behind you." I was confused after reading this. Was this a work friend pranking me or something? I instantly turned around and looked behind me. By now, at least 10 people were back there, but I didn't recognize anyone. The person directly behind me was a woman who I'd never seen before, and she was not on her phone or anything. I didn't think it was her. Everybody else were total strangers as well. Some of them stared at me now because I'd completely turned around and was observing everybody. I couldn't find who it was, so I turned back and texted the number, asking what they meant. They did not immediately respond though. It was a bit weird. Soon enough, it was my turn, and I ordered my food. After getting my sub, I left the Subway restaurant. Before walking out, I observed everybody in line once again, and still didn't notice anything strange. Didn't recognize anyone either. I left the Subway and started walking back to my job. There were a decent amount of other people out on the sidewalk too, because we were so close to the city. Nothing stood out as strange at all. I got back to work and spent the rest of the day without anything strange happening. I left work at 5 p.m. and started to drive home. It took between 15 to 20 minutes to drive back to my house. I remember that when I was driving on the highway, I got another phone call from the same unknown number. This time, I decided to answer it. When I did, a voice that seemed to be a man spoke in a very whispery voice. This person said they were driving right behind me. I asked who it was, but the man hung up immediately. I was very confused. I looked in my mirror and didn't notice anybody driving strangely. Nobody was riding on my tail or anything, and I didn't see anybody driving in a strange way. The highway was very busy, and it was rush hour, so there were tons of other cars on the road behind me. It could have been any of them. How would they even know which one my car was? I continued to drive home, but I didn't want to go directly to my house. When I got to my exit, instead of driving home, I drove to the police station. When I got there, I still didn't see anything out of the usual. I went inside and told them about what happened, but unfortunately, there wasn't really anything that could be done. They said it was more than likely just a prank, but not to hesitate if anything else happened. The strangest thing is, after that, I never received any more calls or texts from that number ever again. I don't even know how they got my number in the first place. I still don't know who did it or why. Maybe it was just a prank, but I mentioned it to several friends and colleagues and no one ever took responsibility. It still remains a creepy mystery to me to this day. This is something that happened recently when I was working at Subway. I've worked here for almost a year now, and I work in a Subway that I would describe as fairly average. We're not in a super busy area, but we're also not located in the middle of nowhere either. One day, at a quiet time in the afternoon, this man came in. I was working behind the counter, and there wasn't anybody else in the store at the time, except for my coworker who happened to be in the back. I'm guessing it was around 2 or 3 p.m. maybe. Right in between the lunch rush hour and dinner, when it was more quiet, a man walked in and came to the spot where you're supposed to order. When I asked him what he said he wanted a $5 footlong. Right away, the guy did not seem to be in the greatest of moods. I carefully asked him what kind of bread he wanted, and started to go towards them to grab one. Before he answered, I thought I should notify him that footlongs are not $5 anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure that promotion hasn't been around in at least 10 years. When I told him this, the man was very obviously angry. I kind of thought the guy was half joking when he said it in the first place, because it's been so long since they were that price. Apparently, he was not joking at all. He asked what the price was, and when I told him, he started going on an unhinged rant about how we always advertised the $5 footlong. He claimed the last time he'd gone here, he'd gotten one for exactly that price. I don't know when exactly that could have been, but it must have been years ago. I told him I couldn't make the prices. I just worked here. He started screaming about how he was going to call Subway corporate and was going to call my manager and all that. I really didn't know what the guy's problem was. Finally, he asked me how cheap I was willing to go, as if he were haggling with me over the price at a pawn shop. I told him I couldn't negotiate the price myself. I just didn't have that kind of power. The man cursed at me, which made me angry, and I yelled at him to get out of the store. That only made him more upset. He started screaming and ranting about Subway and me. He began yelling, saying I should be fired. I told him to leave or I was going to call the cops on him. My coworker, who had been in the back, now finally came out to see what was going on. He also told the man to leave. Before he did, the guy leaned into me and said that he would be back for me, whatever that meant. He turned and stormed out. It was the craziest thing to see. My coworker and I talked about the incident for a while. We were just glad the guy was gone now. Soon, we got some other customers and went about the day as normal. It got quite busy for a while in the evening and then quieted down again at night. Eventually, my coworker left and went home for the evening, and I was left all alone to close the store. Normally, things would be very quiet in the last hour or so. We probably would get just one customer in the final hour we were open. At 9 p.m., we would close. I went over and locked the door, then headed to the back to clean up before I could leave. As I was doing so, I suddenly heard the sound of someone trying to yank the door open. I looked up and saw the very same man from earlier. I got a bad feeling right away when I saw him. He stood at the door and began loudly slamming on it. He saw me behind the counter and started to scream at me. I yelled at him to go away and said we were closed for the evening. The man was yelling something unintelligible that I couldn't really understand. I hoped the guy would simply go away. I did some cleaning in the back area and didn't hear him for a while. When I came back out, to my surprise, he was still there. He was kind of pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, talking to himself out front. It didn't seem he was going to be leaving anytime soon. I finished up all the things I had to do, and now I was ready to leave. Thing is, the man was still there pacing back and forth out front. I knew he was waiting for me to leave. At that point, I called the police and told them the story of this deranged guy. I had to wait until the police got there. The man stayed out front the entire time. Eventually, they talked to him and managed to get him to leave somehow. After that, I was finally able to go back home. Looking back at that situation, I feel lucky I locked the doors right at 9 p.m. when we closed. The man had gotten there minutes later. If he had gotten inside the restaurant, I don't know what he would have done. He was clearly very angry. Since that incident, I haven't seen the guy again, and I'm hoping that I never will. When I was 12 years old, I switched schools when my family moved. The place we went to was very different than where I'd been before. We didn't live in a rural area really, but we did live in a place that was outside of town. My parents would normally give me rides to and from school at this new area, but sometimes they weren't able to. Whenever they couldn't, I didn't really mind walking home. I always took a shortcut through the woods in order to get there a lot faster. I had some problems fitting into school as the new kid. Most of the kids were at that school grew up together. That made it quite difficult for me to make friends. Because of that, I spent a lot of time by myself or making friends with the friendless. Eventually, I became the object of a few bullies for the first time in my life. This took place on a really cool fall day. One of the things I remember most clearly is how the leaves were heavily falling off the trees. It was jacket-wearing weather, but not really cold if you understand. When my parents dropped me off in the morning, they let me know they wouldn't be able to pick me up on time due to work. I let them know I was just going to walk home. After school, it would start getting dark pretty early, even before I made it home. I walked as quickly as I could, not wanting it to get too dark before I got back. I almost regretted taking the shortcut through the woods, but the fear was just normal apprehension. I didn't suspect that anyone was lurking in the woods or anything. Even though there was a bit of wind blowing through the trees that day, I could hear what was going on around me pretty good. Not long into the forest shortcut, I began hearing what sounded like footsteps. Looking around, I expected to see someone else taking the same shortcut or enjoying a walk out in the woods. Thing is, I didn't see anyone else out there but me. I didn't think anything of it at first. I don't think people really begin worrying about hearing footsteps until those footsteps become something worth worrying about. As I was moving forward, suddenly someone walked out from behind a tree in front of me. He was so close to me that it caused me to fall back and down onto the ground. Fortunately, it didn't hurt too bad. I was scared to realize this was Kurt, one of the kids at school who bullied me. He was holding a pocket knife in his right hand as he lurched over me. He had this really evil smile on his face, a look I'll never forget years later. I quickly got up to my feet and did the only thing I could think to do in that moment. When I had fallen onto the ground, my hand had grabbed onto a rock, so I held onto it before I got back up again. Not waiting for a single second to see what he'd do, I threw the rock right at Kurt's face, hitting him below the eye and staggering him. While he was holding his face and cussing, I ran past him as quickly as I could. That was my biggest advantage. I ran a lot, and I could run long and fast. It didn't take very long before I heard Kurt screaming behind me that he was going to kill me. He kept yelling and must have been chasing me, but I did my best job not to look back and see him. I just kept running and running. Luckily, Kurt was not nearly in as good a shape as I was. He never participated much in gym class or sports. By the time I got out of the woods, I was no longer even hearing his screams at me. That didn't matter, however. I still continued to run until I got to my home, which I locked myself inside quickly. I kept the lights out and kept a lookout for Kurt until my parents got home. I told them what happened and they contacted the police. I guess Kurt's parents and the police gave him a good, firm talking to, because although he still gave me dirty looks whenever he saw me, he never again tried to confront me. I'm 22 years old. We used to have a neighbor who was around 60 to 70. I think he died a few years ago. When he was alive, he would always cause us so much trouble. Scratched our car, poisoned our apple trees and grass, blew up a firework near me that caused me to temporarily go deaf in one ear when I was 4. He did all kinds of messed up things. His son was a judge in our city, so pretty much everything we took to court was against us. I remember Dad often called us from work to tell us not to be alone at home and we would have to stay at Grandma's. When I was little, I think around 6 or 7, I would frequently have nightmares about seeing a face outside the bathroom window. The window is above our bathtub, high enough that no one can actually see in unless they climb the roof of our shed, which is underneath the bathroom window in our garden. Coincidentally, the shed is directly next to a fence that separated our garden from the neighbor's one. I still remember the dreams. I remember having them pretty much every other night. I never told my parents when I was little, because we never really talked about anything. I didn't really share anything that was happening to me. I grew up thinking that they were just dreams and that was that because of it. I did mention them to my therapist last year because we were discussing some personal problems and I felt like maybe this was connected. After coming home, my mom asked me what I talked about with my therapist, so I finally shared that I used to have such dreams. I never really thought about them being real. Thing is, she told me I actually told her when I was younger that I'd seen our neighbor on our shed's roof. I don't remember that at all, but she said I told her several times. Even my friends told her they saw him when they came over to our house. It really creeped them out. Apparently, I never mentioned him watching me in the shower. After she told me that, though, it really clicked for me. It was as if I suddenly remembered. Yeah, he would stand there on the roof of the shed and watch me in the bathroom. The fact that happened still creeps me out. There was another incident that creeped me out as well. It happened when I was around 9 or 10. I remember I went to the balcony in the evening. The balcony door was in my room, and I often went there to call my cat home in the evening. This time, though, I saw a person standing in the middle of our garden. It was already dark out, so I couldn't really tell who it was. I waited for a little bit to see what the person would do, but they weren't moving at all. They were just standing, staring in front of themselves. I called out asking if it was my dad, because obviously I expected it to be him, even if that would be a little odd. The person just looked up at me, and even though it was dark, I could tell immediately it was someone else. I went to my dad who was downstairs, but when he looked, no one was there. When I went back upstairs to my room and to the balcony again, I noticed my neighbor's back door closing just as I looked over. I don't remember if it was directly the next day or a few days later, but our grass turned brown. We found out it had been poisoned. Something weird happened on a walk I took recently. I don't know if this should be shared, but tonight I was on a walk with my dog. Same route, same time as normal. I was walking my usual path, and this part of the walk happened to be the darkest part. There was an alley off to the left that had absolutely no light going in. All of a sudden, as I was walking past, my dog suddenly went on high alert and began barking like crazy. I had my headphones on, but I knew instantly that something was wrong. I looked down to the alley, but I didn't see anything at first. As my eyes began to adjust, I noticed a very tall and skinny man standing there in the darkness. He didn't move at all. He was just facing me and staring at me from what I could tell. He was dressed in all black, almost completely blending in. His pants and shirt were long, which was weird because it had been 90 to 100 all week. Not to mention it was 10:30 at night, and this man was wearing a giant black sun hat. I kind of froze and said, pretty loudly as I turned my headphones off so I could listen in. The man standing there didn't even say anything. I turned towards him but kept walking forward. After a second of him being silent and me trying to walk away, chalking it up to a creepy but harmless encounter, he began to follow me. The man followed me for about 5 minutes, saying absolutely nothing, just silently walking behind me and staring. When I felt like I could finally speak out, I yelled that my dog was going to bite him. That seemed to scare him a bit, because he slowly followed me for 30 more seconds, then slipped onto the sidewalk and went a different way. When he turned around to get away, I noticed he had a huge backpack on that was extremely full of something. I have a really uneasy feeling about this. I go on this path almost every night, and this night this man just so happened to be standing there in the darkest alley. There's a missing woman 3 minutes away from me, and it's alleged that she was attacked a few days prior to her sudden disappearance. I wonder if I should report this to the non-emergency line. I don't really know where to go from here, and I'm pretty freaked out. It was 2007. I was 13 and the new SmackDown v Raw WWE game had just come out. I went into my small town on a Sunday morning to purchase it. After purchasing the game, I was admiring the cover and the synopsis on the back of it. I sat down on a bench to read it and take in the excitement of my new buy. I lived in a small market town in England, so Sundays were often very quiet. Whilst sitting on the bench, I looked over to the bus stop across the road and noticed a strange-looking, scraggly man walking over to me. I was a bit nervous seeing this. Although I was 13 or 14, I looked to be about 11, since I was a very petite boy. On his approach, he asked me what I was holding, and I explained it was my new game. As the man got closer, I said, "I need to go. My brother is waiting for me at the mall." Even though he wasn't, I suddenly felt the need to say this. As I walked off, the man began to follow me. asking my name and age. I replied with a fake name. On entering the mall, I started walking quicker and quicker, but I didn't start running for some reason. I guess I wanted to save face. The man kept asking if I had a girlfriend. As he got closer, I noticed a big scar down his face and lots of identifiable jewelry. To this question, I responded yes, as I thought that may put him off if he knew I had a girlfriend. I ran into a shop in the mall and started flicking through random magazines. He persisted with following me. Eventually, I got the courage to run as fast as I could. He tried to chase me, but I managed to get away. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents. I just went upstairs and played my game. Later that day, I began feeling bad about it though, so I told my mom, and she called the police right away. I had to go to the police station local to myself and tell them what happened. Also, pick the man out of a number of photos the police had on their laptop. Apparently, the man had kidnapped and raped many young boys. I was lucky enough to escape his grasp. I found out he was given 8 years in prison after a couple of boys he attacked came forward. However, my evidence ended up not being enough to help. This happened years ago, but for some reason it popped into my head recently. I had just moved to be with my best friend. My home life wasn't the greatest, and it was my first time living away from home. We lived in a gated community. Leaving the community, on my end, there was a very busy street. One night, my friend had to work, but it was my day off. I decided I wanted to walk to the store. To get there, I had to walk along a busy street. It wasn't a long walk at all, really, only about 5 blocks or so. As soon as I hit the sidewalk outside the community, though, a red car slowly rolled past me. As soon as they'd fully passed me by, they slammed into reverse, like they were the only person driving down that street. I, being a naive girl from the Midwest, stopped where I was, thinking he was going to ask for directions to some place or something. At that point, I would at least be able to say I was not from around here. But that's not what happened. The man rolled up right next to me and just stared at me. His eyes were bright red and bloodshot, like he had been drinking heavily or smoking. I kept on walking from then on, but the man started to drive in front of me and stop a few feet ahead of me. At one point, he just did a head nod, telling me to come here. I started booking it right then. I was approaching the store, and there were some hedges in front of me. I'd like to say that I jumped over the hedges and landed on my feet, but I basically tripped over them. I got my foot caught and landed on my knees. The man continued to drive after me, but I got back up and hauled ass to the store. I caught my breath and looked back through the glass door. The fucker had parked outside. I waited inside for the man to leave, but didn't tell anyone that I thought I was being followed. The man did eventually leave after a while, and my dumbass grabbed some snacks, then walked out the door and headed home. I was too panicked to really think clearly. Thankfully, he did not try to follow me again on my walk home. I was 12 years old. My next-door neighbor's son was 19, and he was sort of damaged, I guess you could say. Always in trouble with the police, stealing cars, heavy drinking, always fighting. He was like an older brother to me, though, even after he stole 3 of my bikes to sell them for drugs. Anyway, one morning I went over to his house around 3 a.m. to play some Nintendo. This was a while ago. His girlfriend had spent the night, and they ended up getting into a fierce argument. Nothing new. I was used to seeing them argue. Anyway, after a while, it got really out of hand. He punched her, dragged her across 2 rooms and into the living room, where I was playing Nintendo. He pulled out a knife and held it to her throat, and I remember he actually cut her. My grandmother heard the screaming because the houses connected and the walls were thin. She called the police, and a big standoff ended up happening. He dragged her around the house for a good 2 hours, knife in hand with her throat bleeding, threatening to kill everyone inside. They eventually got him to open the wooden door and talk through the screen door, or so they claimed. The second the wooden door opened, he was rushed by 5 cops in body armor and one with a shield. It was the scariest morning of my entire life. I was just a child when this story happened. My parents were divorcing, but my father had always been violent. As he was not looking for an apartment himself and was very demanding, he lived with us during the divorce. One evening, though, I really had the fear of my life put into me. My mother had put my sisters and I to bed early. I always had trouble sleeping because I would hear my father yelling insults at my mother for hours and hours on end. Apparently, he didn't understand why she wanted to leave him. It was obvious, but narcissists generally don't recognize their own mistakes. They think they're completely perfect. That evening, it must have been almost midnight. I was just about starting to doze off when another howl woke me up. This time, it was my mother. My sisters and I got up and ran. We found my mother crying on the stairway. My father had hit her so hard that her head had slammed against the wall. She was screaming at him not to touch her. We immediately rushed towards her to surround and protect her. I was 9 years old, but even I understood. After all, I'd always been afraid of my father. He always hurt us. I was afraid of him, but I refused to leave my mother at his mercy. We took my mother to her room, while my older sister stopped my father from going upstairs. He kept saying she was hysterical and crazy. Above all, he didn't even recognize it was him who was causing all these problems. My mother was having trouble calming down and told us to get dressed quickly. When my father saw us coming back down all dressed to go out, he started insulting her again, asking where she was taking us, as if she had to tell him. Afraid that he might decide to hurt one of us, she told him she was taking us to McDonald's to get our mind off things. She took her coat and put us in the car before driving off. She didn't go in the direction of fast food at all, though. She drove around the city, parking in a parking lot I'd never seen before. From there, she guided us on foot to the city center, to the police station. It had been too much. She had seen the hatred in his eyes. He would have beaten her to death if we hadn't arrived in that moment. Not that we knew that at the time. Just as we arrived at the gate of the police station, we saw my father. He was coming out of the park right across the street. He had been searching for us. Unfortunately, he had just found us. We rushed inside, and seeing our panic, a policewoman took us to an office. As she closed the door, we heard my father enter the building and start hurling insults, asking where my mother was, while calling her names. He said she had nothing against him, that she didn't have the right to take us away, that kind of thing. We could hear him screaming like that for a whole hour. I was crying in my mother's arms. My older sister was shaking in fear. My other sister was the only one who was able to speak and tell the officer who'd stayed with us everything that happened. After a while, my dad finally left. The police station became suddenly very silent. Another policewoman poked her head in through the door and asked us if he had been drinking. The worst part was he never drank. He was just like that normally. The police explained to us that they had told my father to take his things and leave. They made us stay on their premises for a while making sure he had left and taking my mother's statement. My mother, however, still wanted to take us to fast food before going home. My sister absolutely wanted her cell phone back, which she had forgotten to take in a panic. The police officers were very reassuring. They asked us to call them urgently if my father came back, and then we were able to head home. When we arrived, the house was silent. Everything was turned off, and my father's car was no longer there. Relieved, my mother asked my sister to hurry up and grab her phone while we waited in the car. She took the keys and ran towards the house, but when she got to the door and opened it, she let out a scream of terror. My mother panicked and opened the car door to get out before seeing my father running furiously towards her. She just had enough time to tuck her leg back in before he slammed the door against it. She then had the reflex to lock all the doors, although she was worried about my sister outside. He started yelling again. He pulled on the handles and smacked against the car. This lasted about 10 minutes before sirens came to interrupt my father. 2 police cars and a police van arrived in front of our house. My sister had run into her room and called the police on her forgotten cell phone, which she'd come to get in the first place. My father still blamed my mother all the while, screaming that she dared to call the cops even though she had been in front of him all this time. The police almost jumped out of their vehicles, hands ready at their batons. One of them pinned my father against the car and handcuffed him, asking him why he was still there, and reminding him he'd been told to leave. My father was no longer proud. The only excuse he could come up with was that he couldn't find his underwear. The police stayed while he finally packed his things and left. They waited until he got into his car, which he had hidden around the corner, and watched as he drove away. They reassured my mother they were going to make rounds all night. My mother thanked them, and we left the neighborhood to finally go to the promised restaurant. Only when we arrived at the neighboring street, my father's car, which had been hiding, pulled right onto the road to follow behind us. What he had not expected, however, for some reason, was that the police van was escorting us. When we arrived at the restaurant, my father continued straight on the main road and left the city altogether, while the police made 3 laps around the McDonald's, provoking many questions from all the customers. Once we returned, we were afraid he would still be waiting for us, but as promised, the police kept watch all night, and he did not return. Needless to say, we didn't sleep a wink that night though, and had great difficulty sleeping for several weeks after. I've been an insomniac ever since, and today, at 28 years old, I still can't sleep without sleeping pills. Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. My name is Tony and I live in Paris. I decided this summer, with the health crisis and all, to stay in France and go south for the holidays. Going to the PACA region more precisely. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly go as planned. I'm going to tell you this story so that everyone can realize that you have to be wary of everyone at all times, especially if you're going to a place where you don't know anyone. Like I'd said, my girlfriend and I decided to go to the PACA region for the holidays. We rented an apartment on Airbnb. It wasn't the first time we'd rented on this platform, and so far it had always gone quite well. We were able to see different photos of the apartment, so we were sure of our choice, especially since the apartment was in a private residence in the city center. As you know, you can see the photo of the owner of the rental property as well, except this one, there was no photo. And to avoid having too many problems, we'll call the owner Paul. On the day of departure, my girlfriend and I were super happy to discover everything in the region. The trip was going great so far. We'd arrived a little bit early, and so we decided to tour the city a bit before we could check into the apartment at 6 p.m. At around 5:30, we headed over to the address. I parked my car on the street where the residence was located. We received a message from Paul, who told us he would arrive in 10 minutes. 10 minutes passed by and we arrived in front of the entrance to the residence. The man got out of his car and called out to us. "Hey, you the guys that rented my apartment?" I instinctively answered yes, asking him if he was really Paul. After all, there was no photo provided. The man in front of me said yes, and we were reassured. The man was quite well dressed and didn't seem to be acting suspicious at all. He took us over to his apartment. We passed through the exterior parking lot of the residence before arriving in front of the building in question. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was an elevator up to it. My first observation was that the apartment was slightly different from what had been represented in the photos. It wasn't like shockingly different or anything. It basically could have amounted to a simple change in decorations. The second observation was we wouldn't have thought the apartment was for rent at all, for several reasons. There were crumbs on the table, there were dishes stored in the sink, and things scattered all around. It looked as if someone was living there permanently, not renting it out to tourists. To tell you the truth, that didn't really worry me though. I told myself it was possible that Paul lived here and rented his apartment whenever he went out from time to time. That in itself was not super weird. I didn't care that the apartment wasn't too clean. We were going to be out enjoying our vacation anyway. That really should have caught my attention though. There was one thing that alerted and warned me now though. Paul's behavior became quite strange as soon as we entered the premises. Why, you ask? Well, because he had very specific rules on where we could pack our things away. For example, in the bedroom there was this small shelf with storage drawers. Paul told us that was where we should store our wallets and valuable jewelry. In fact, his tone of voice encouraged us to put our valuables there right now, as if he needed to know where we were going to be storing these precious belongings. Paul also began asking us more and more personal questions. Did we have any family here? Did we know the surroundings well? Was it our first time here? Did we live far away? At the time, I replied we did have family here, even though we didn't at all. My instincts were telling me to be wary of this person. Even though I'm telling you this in a lot of detail, you have to remember that I only noticed all these things in a couple of minutes max. It was a first glance sort of thing. If you were not a paranoid person, I don't think you'd really think anything was that abnormal about this situation. The worst was yet to come though. The tour was about to end and Paul had to leave the keys with us. Before he left, I had the strong urge to go to the bathroom, so my girlfriend stayed to talk with Paul. I go to wash my hands, and then my phone vibrates. On my screen, I see Paul's number. Well, that's strange. Why would Paul be sending me a message if he's right in the next room talking to my girlfriend? I open my phone, only to become immediately petrified. Hey guys, sorry for the delay. My car broke down on the road. I'll be there in about 15 to 20 minutes. I saw the message was sent only 1 minute ago. I quickly realized that if Paul had broken down his car, then the man that was with us was not Paul at all. I was in a total panic. I came out of the bathroom and tried to keep a poker face as best as I could. This false Paul asked me if I was okay. I told him yes, and asked my girlfriend to come with me to unload the car. I was planning to leave right away and notify the police without this stranger noticing anything. Problem was, as soon as we went to leave, this fake Paul insisted on helping us unload. I told myself he might try to do something to us once our suitcases were brought inside. An attack? A theft? Who knows? I got in on his game and told him to stay at the foot of the elevator so we could take the suitcases to him and he could bring them up to the apartment while my girlfriend and I unloaded the car. Thankfully, he was fooled. My girlfriend and I went downstairs while Paul waited for the suitcases as planned. Arriving on the ground floor, I hastened to tell my girlfriend everything and even showed her the message as well. She really started panicking. I then told her the best thing to do was call the police and then join up with the real Paul. My girlfriend called the police and explained the situation to them, while I also called Paul and asked if he was coming soon. The police said they would arrive on scene in 10 minutes. I took my car with my girlfriend inside and parked it on the street opposite the residence, just in case the false Paul came down to get us. The real Paul sent me a message telling us he had arrived. We joined him and immediately I felt reassured. The man in front of me really inspired me with some confidence. He was very professional. We decided to tell him the whole story very quickly. He immediately understood our dismay. He told us he thought he knew who the man was who was pretending to be him. It would be a man named Lorenzo who lived in an apartment located in the same residence as Paul. Lorenzo was a tenant who caused many problems, according to him. The police arrived and we decided to take them to the residence directly. Arriving at the parking lot, we see a silhouette in the distance though. It was Lorenzo. When he saw the police, he went completely crazy. He began insulting us, saying everything was our fault, and that it had really now come to this. His speech was incomprehensible. He was going berserk. The police arrested him after a struggle, and we didn't hear from Lorenzo for 3 days. In the meantime, Paul moved us into his real apartment, which matched the photos perfectly and was very clean. The police called us 3 days after. It turns out Lorenzo had lost his job due to the health crisis, and his landlord had evicted him from the apartment in which he was staying for non-payment of rent. In addition, Lorenzo seemed to have an addiction to some kind of drug, which explained his mood swings. The police think that Lorenzo wanted to steal as many valuable items as possible from us to resell them, or possibly worse. He was placed under police surveillance while a doctor came to establish a behavioral diagnosis. And so, that's my story. Apart from those events, our vacation actually went really well, even if we were really freaked out at the time, and even a little during the rest of the vacation, I'll admit. This story is to tell you to be careful when renting something out in a place you don't know anyone. Always ask for a photo of the owner of the property. Thankfully, the real Paul was a nice guy, but you never know. I hope this story can help you all one day. For context, my name is Benjamin. At the time, I was 14 years old. I lived in a small village with my parents, my sister, and my dog. It all started during the summer holidays, during the month of July. It was the middle of the afternoon. I had an old laptop, and I wasn't really paying attention to the sites I was going to. What I mean is I was going to lots of unsecured websites, and on websites where you weren't supposed to be if you were under 18 years old. All of a sudden, my computer restarted by itself. On the blue screen, there was a message supposedly from the police, telling me that if I did not pay by bank card an amount of 300 euros within a maximum period of 15 days, I would have problems with the law. Needless to say, I was in a panic. I restarted my PC, but this message was still there. I didn't know what to do. In my panic, I called my father, who was out in the garden. I was in tears. I was imagining all sorts of bad things happening. He came to check on me with my mother and asked me what I was so upset about. I explained to them and tried to reassure myself, seeing as I was panicking. My uncle was very knowledgeable on computers, so he completely reset my PC for me, and there was no more message. 2 weeks later, as luck would have it, something else happened. It was a Saturday afternoon where the weather was very nice. All the windows and doors were open, and my dog was in the garden. I was home with my father, my sister, and my dog. My mother was out working. My father had to quickly go to the optician in the village, 10 minutes away by car from my house. He had to grab his new glasses. My father left, telling me that in less than 30 minutes he would be back. I found myself at home with my sister and my dog now. As my luck would have it, 5 minutes after his departure, the phone began to ring. I was very shy and didn't often answer the phone myself. I don't know why this time I decided to do it. A lady was on the phone. I only understood half of what she was saying to me, but she began talking to me explicitly about the message I'd had on my PC. I was paralyzed on the phone. "Don't move from your house. We're coming right now." I'd never told them my address. She hung up. I was stuck for 30 seconds. I had a realization. I ran outside to get my dog. I also called my sister and told her to close all the windows and shutters. She didn't really understand what was going on. She was 5 years younger than me. She saw I was serious though and listened to me right away. 2 minutes later, everything was closed and locked up tight. I started telling myself that I was simply making a fuss over nothing. I didn't really need to call my father. Maybe they were just messing with me to try and get money out of me or something. Nobody was going to come to my house over this. All of a sudden, though, the doorbell started to ring. I started to panic. My dog started to bark. She was well trained, so I made her stop, and I told my sister not to make a single noise. It was a distressing moment. They kept ringing over and over again, and we had no way of checking to see who this was without them seeing us as well. In the meantime, I told my sister and my dog to hide under the bed in my sister's room. Eventually, the doorbell did stop ringing. Small clarification, we had closed the shutter of my sister's room but not closed the window all the way, so we could hear the noise from outside. There was a stone path at my house, and we heard the sound of the stones when we walked on them. We could hear someone walking out there right now. Even my young sister understood how serious this was now. We cried without making any noise. The house telephone was on the opposite side of where we were. We heard people knocking on the window shutter several times, shouting to open it. We could hear them circling the house once more. Then we didn't hear anything else. After a while, I took my courage in both hands. I emerged from that room without making any noise just in case. I called my father in tears, telling him to come home right now. Someone was trying to get into our home. He tried to reassure me by saying he was hurrying home right now. He called my neighbor to come help us and to see what was happening to be sure before calling the police. When she arrived, no one was there. My father arrived 2 minutes later. I explained everything to him. He looked at the call history, and it was a hidden number. I know he believed me, because when he left, he was sure he had closed the gate of the house, which was now wide open outside. Since then, I've spoken about this incident to 2 to 3 people at maximum, and with my parents, of course. We've never spoken about it again, and we never received any more news about this story. Because of this incident, though, I was traumatized. I can't stand being alone at home. So yeah, that's my little anecdote. I don't know if anyone will really hear this, but what happened to me was so crazy that I had to tell it. Back in the 1970s, my uncle used to spend a couple of weeks in his hunting cabin that was in the middle of nowhere up in Canada. Most of the time, his trips were very relaxing and enjoyable. He would head back home afterwards feeling refreshed and having unplugged from society for a while. He used to tell me that he had some of the best moments of his life just sitting on his front step, watching the stars fade from the sky and the dawn appear on the horizon. He was a real man of the earth who enjoyed being one with nature. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised he never just sold his condo and went full Amish. There was one year that nearly derailed his loner lifestyle, though, and scared him so much he nearly sold the cabin altogether. He never went back either. It's the most popular story circulated through my extended family, and the reason I always triple-check my locks before going to bed now. For some context, the cabin was not accessible by vehicle. There was a medium amount of hiking involved to reach it. It was around 400 square feet and was made up of a single room. There was no running water and no electricity either. It was a wooden structure built upon a small stone foundation. Because of this, there was about a 12-inch space between the ground and the floor of the cabin. There was a trap door by the fireplace, where he would drop extra logs of firewood so he wouldn't have to venture outside to collect more. The incident happened in October. It was extremely cold even by Canadian standards. When he wasn't at the cabin, he had the front door locked with a padlock. Upon entering this time, the very first thing he noted was the hint of tobacco in the air. This confused him obviously, because he didn't smoke himself, and he hadn't been in the cabin since January. He shrugged it off though and got himself settled in. His first order of business was to get a fire going. He lit lanterns, unpacked, pulled his chair to the fire, and fell asleep. He woke up several times during the night though, always in a state of panic as if the chair was tipping over and he was falling. The wind was roaring so hard outside and the cabin walls were creaking so much he shrugged it off as paranoia. Eventually he left his chair and went to bed instead. He awoke one more time that night when the dawn was just beginning to peek through the window. He shot up in bed when he heard a loud roar of the wind. Through his haze of sleep, he thought he saw a figure outside the window. He scrambled out of bed, knocking over his chair. He grabbed his hunting rifle and bolted across the room. He flung open the front door. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, but there weren't any signs of footprints outside. He slammed his door shut, put down his rifle, and muttered a few profanities. As he righted his chair, he opened the trapdoor and grabbed a few more logs. He put them on the fire, and then went back to bed. It should be noted that the lanterns were burning low when he woke up, as was the fire, so there wasn't much light in the room at all. At about 9 a.m., he woke up for good to the sun shining now brightly through the cabin windows. He got up, warmed some water for coffee by setting the kettle down on the shelf over the fire, and then opened the front door. He said what he saw next nearly gave him a heart attack. There were footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin's front door. My uncle, being his normal impulsive self, threw some clothes and boots on, grabbed his rifle, and followed those footprints through the trees, his gun ready for confrontation. The footprints circled up the surrounding hills, and my uncle followed them until they ended at a spot where the entrance of the cabin was in plain sight. The intruder had clearly crouched for a long while. He then noted a further set of tracks a ways off, a good stride further into the woods. Based on the boot size of these footprints, the stranger was just as large as my strapping 6-foot uncle, if not bigger, and was clearly expecting my uncle to notice his tracks and come after him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stopped to watch the cabin. He would have continued to make his escape. My uncle didn't want to fall into any kind of trap, so he fired a single shot into the air as a warning and made his way back to the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and opened the trap door by his fireplace. As he poked his head down, he scanned the area underneath the cabin with a flashlight and discovered one of his own blankets and a dirty, tangled mess in the corner. There were many empty soup cans he recognized from his own pantry, a single spoon, and several dozen small bones, most likely squirrels or rabbits. What my uncle thinks occurred was that somehow an intruder had broken into the cabin while my uncle was away and had been hiding under the floor the entire time. He came to the conclusion that the reason he kept being jolted awake the night before was because half of the chair had been resting on top of the trap door, and whoever was below was trying to get out by lifting the hatch. Later on, when my uncle thought he saw a figure outside the window, he later realized that figure must have actually been inside and was heading for the door to escape. He was interrupted when my uncle got up. The man had likely then left back down through the trap door. My uncle knocking over the chair must have really startled him. The creepiest thing about all this wasn't that a complete stranger was hiding so close by. It was the fact my uncle thought he was all alone when someone had been with him observing him the entire time. It really calls into question who this person was and what his motives were. It's never been confirmed how the man broke into the cabin, but he was already under the floor when my uncle arrived, which tells me he was going to great lengths to make sure he wasn't discovered. When he finally emerged from underneath, he could have killed my uncle in his sleep easily, but instead he took the opportunity to run. It's possible he was simply a squatter, or decided he didn't want to risk a struggle. I think whoever he is, he was on the run, or at the very least had something to hide. Earlier that same year in May, not very far away from my uncle's cabin, A 17-year-old girl had gone missing while walking up the road to visit her cousins. Shortly after, in August, a 21-year-old woman was found stabbed to death on the very same road the girl had disappeared on. I believe whoever was in my uncle's cabin could very well have had something to do with one or both of these unsolved crimes. My uncle never reported the incident to the police, and to the best of his knowledge, the intruder never returned. It really makes me wonder to this day, though, are we really ever alone when we think we are? Because if someone could be hiding underneath the floor in an isolated cabin during the winter, is it really so impossible there could be someone under your bed right now or something? Things to think about, I guess. Back in the early 2000s, I'd just graduated from high school and was spending the first few days of summer camping out in the woods on my grandfather's property in Maine. I was with my two best friends, Heather and Kim, all of us being big outdoor enthusiasts who enjoyed climbing up trees and lying out under the stars at night. On the second day of our camping trip, we decided to take our tent deeper into the woods so we wouldn't be able to see my grandfather's house anymore. We liked the idea of feeling alone and independent. After we set up the tent, we started a little game of capture the flag, where we each had a different colored towel that we got to hide in plain sight, either up in a tree or in a hole somewhere. Then we would search for our opponent's towel and try to get it back to home base, which was at the tent. I wasn't very good at winning this game, and I was determined to go the extra mile this time. The rules were that the flag had to be visible enough so the colors stood out at a short distance away, but I was going to bend the rules a bit and hide the flag in a small cave I knew was nearby. Both girls were unlikely to venture too far into this cave to look. I had been inside several times and referred to it as Tiger Lily's Cave, you know, like the character from Peter Pan. It was small and narrow, and you had to crouch to walk in, but I didn't mind risking cobwebs in my hair to win. I went as far back into the cave as I could and dropped a bright green towel on the ground. Visible enough if you walked deep enough into the cave, you would immediately find it. When I noticed something just beyond the edge of the daylight streaming through the entrance, though, I took note immediately. I saw something glittering against the sun. I figured it was a coin or something. I moved in to take a closer look when I discovered it was a buckle on a strap of a man's suspenders. The end of the buckle was lying down, as motionless as a dead snake. The other end of the suspenders was attached to the pants of a man's body, laying face down on the ground. His head was wrapped up tightly in a plastic bag. I shrieked and ran back outside the cave. I was screaming for my friends until they came running. I told them I just found a body with a plastic bag over their head. All three of us immediately went back into the cave, and in the semi-darkness, we all started speaking very fast and loud, arguing whether this was even real and how it could have possibly gotten there. It was Heather who pointed out that this was clearly the victim of a murderer, and we had to get out of there. Who knows if the murderer would return? We ran back out of the cave as fast as we could while crouched over, then sprinted back to my grandfather's house. Go figure, he wasn't even home. I called my mom from the kitchen phone, and she told us to call the police. By the time my mom, my grandfather, and the two policemen had all arrived, 40 minutes had gone by. We led them with much more confidence and excitement this time than fear, back to Tiger Lily Cave, where I immediately noticed the leaves had been disturbed. One of the policemen crouched down and wandered in with a flashlight. After a few minutes, he called out to the group that there was no body any longer, but there was plenty of dried blood and clear evidence that something heavy had recently been dragged out. He emerged from the cave holding my bright green towel. There was now blood all over it, showing against the fabric. We were immediately sent home. In the next 12 hours or so, there was a circus of people walking back and forth in and out of the woods. More than a dozen more cops arrived with dogs as well to track whoever had removed the corpse. I remember all of us grilling out on the back deck and watching the cops move in and out. A few of them even stopped to eat with us and filled us in on the details. By the next day, most of them were gone. One police car was stationed on the street by my grandfather's driveway just to keep an eye on things. Surprisingly, no reporters ever came to interview us, and we never heard anything further about it on the news. I gave the best description of the body that I could, but given it was dark and there was a bag over the man's head, the best I could do was describe his outfit. After another week or so, the police released the scene, and we never heard from them again. We never found out what happened to the body or who dragged it away. My grandfather has since passed away, but his property was sold to a family I know very well, and since then I've taken my kids to the cave for them to explore. It's one of the most exciting and mysterious childhood memories I have. Finding a body in a spooky cave in the wilderness. That's the stuff Stephen King novels are built on. When I was 17, I had the extreme misfortune of breaking both my legs at the same time. I had been playing football with some of my friends out behind my house in a wide open field. There was a barn back there that had been abandoned and was slowly rotting away. The barn was built so it was nestled onto the side of the hill, so you could walk around the far end of the barn to climb up the hill and walk up onto the roof. I was being a bit of a dick during the game, and I deliberately ran through what we had marked as out of bounds. I ran up the hill and across the barn roof, intending to leap down off of it and score a bogus touchdown. Due to the rain, though, the wooden roof beams were wet and soggy, and when the wood gave out under my legs, I crashed downward through the ceiling. I landed hard on some old farming instruments inside, including buckets, a set of horseshoes, and a spare tire for an old tractor. I'm actually pretty damn lucky I didn't just get impaled by a pitchfork or something. Anyway, to make a long story short, I broke both of my legs and dislocated my left arm. I had a concussion too. I was rushed to the hospital and was discharged in a wheelchair, where I was forced to stay on the ground floor of my house. While I was recovering, one night my parents and sister decided they wanted to go see the new Lord of the Rings movie that was playing, and kind of without any warning, they just said they were leaving. I found myself all alone in the house now. At first, I didn't really mind. I had complete control of the TV and could play my video games as much as I wanted to, but before long, I started getting frustrated. Most of my things were upstairs where I couldn't get them. I couldn't reach the microwave or any of the higher cabinets. I was very limited on what I could do. I began to feel a bit bitter. I rolled myself into the dining room without turning on the lights and peeked out into the backyard across the field, into the barn. I'm not sure what made me look back there. It was very dark and there wasn't really much to see either. I was always the type to be aware of my surroundings in order to ensure my peace of mind. I looked out at the stars behind the barn for a few moments and was about to roll myself backwards and return to the kitchen when I saw something by the light of the moon. I saw two figures walking out of the barn and making their way down towards my house. I froze, too nervous to even let the curtains fall back into place. I made myself stare back towards the approaching figures. They weren't just walking, they were holding hands, it seemed. I remember speaking out loud, "Are those kids or something?" I felt most of the fear melt away, and it was replaced by confusion and annoyance. Who were these brats trespassing on our property at 9 o'clock at night? We lived in a pretty secluded area, and it would have taken quite a lot of walking through the woods in the dark to enter our backyard from that direction. That's when I made my first mistake. I opened the window and called out to them, "Hey, what are you doing?" Both figures immediately stopped dead in their tracks, still holding hands but otherwise keeping completely still. "Get out of our yard," I called out. There were perhaps 5 seconds of silence before one of them called out in a voice so calm it made all the terror and fear come rushing back. "Can we come in?" The voice sounded muffled, and at this point my eyes had adjusted to the darkness a bit better now. Now that I got a better look at them, I could tell that they weren't kids at all. I would say they were probably older teenagers actually, and seemed to be wearing white porcelain masks over their faces. They had hand-painted some sadistic smiles on them. My response died in my throat, and my hands began to shake. I slammed the window shut and wheeled myself fast back across the dining room and into the living room. I shut off the TV and lights, casting the house into darkness. I rolled into the den. I got out of my wheelchair and crawled across the floor to the window. I peeked out. They were still in the same spot, holding hands, staring right at my house. I watched them for a few more seconds when one of them raised their other hand and waved at me. Not in the general direction of the house, mind you, right at me. I ducked back down and started freaking out, cursing. I had turned out all the lights. There was no way they could have seen my half a face peeking out at them from the distance, especially in the dark. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know if all the doors were locked, if the garage door was shut, or even when my family would be back home. I felt completely helpless, knowing I didn't have any strength or ability to check every room in the house to make sure it was locked up tight. I went to the phone on the desk and frantically called my mom's phone, but her cell was off. She was likely still in the movie. Same thing with my dad. I thought about calling the cops, but I didn't know exactly what to tell them, to be honest. Sure, there were 2 people trespassing on my property, but they hadn't attempted to break in or do anything to me yet. I didn't know how to put into words the sense of urgency and danger I was feeling. I crawled back over to my wheelchair, climbed up into it, and rolled myself through the darkness and into the hallway that separated the living room and the kitchen. That's when I heard a knock at the door. I heard a muffled voice call out again, "Can we come in?" I turned away from the door and made my way toward the stairs, intending to climb them on my hands and knees if I had to. I'd crawl up to my room and lock myself in there. My front door had a strip of narrow windows going vertically down along the door frame, and when I was nearly at the stairs, a masked face peered in at me through one of the windows. Shortly after, I heard the teens outside giggling. Upon making eye contact with the mask, the person crooked their head to the side. I froze like a deer in the headlights. All I could do was stare back. I remember it so perfectly. Even as I write this out, my hands are shaking. The masked face disappeared from view, and that's when I noticed the deadbolt to the front door was unlocked. All anyone had to do was turn the knob and they could walk right in. There was another knock at the back door, another small muffled voice. I could barely hear what they were saying because of the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I shut my eyes and buried my face into my hands. I heard rattling coming from the back door. I'm not very religious, but in that moment I prayed to whoever was listening. I'm not sure how long I sat there, crying and waiting for one of those doors to open, but after what felt like 10 minutes, I looked up and there was no one peeking in through the window at me anymore. I slid out of my chair and crawled slowly to the stairs. I crawled painstakingly up them into my room, where I shut the door and locked it. I'm not positive about this last part, but right before I managed to shut my door, I glanced down the dark hallway behind me, and I thought I saw the shadowy outline of a figure slowly tiptoeing up the stairs. I then proceeded to suffer through the longest night of my life. I never heard anything else, from either inside the house or outside. My parents and sister arrived after 1 a.m., and by that time I was soaked in sweat. They thought by the look on my face I must have suffered a stroke or something, and nearly called the ambulance for me. I never saw those masked people again. Of course, my parents didn't believe me. Why would they? There was no evidence anyone had broken in. It was much easier for them to conclude I just had a nightmare. My legs have since healed, and even though I still walk with a slight limp, there was otherwise no permanent damage. If I had to choose, though, I would rather break both of my legs all over again, just to avoid that feeling of helplessness and terror I felt that night. That night when I looked into the hollow eyes of that porcelain-masked person. This happened in October of 2014. I'm originally from a small town, but I moved into a larger area in the Midwest for grad school. When this happened, I'd rented a room and shared a house with other students near the university. It was an older 2-story house, with a 1-story extension in the back which served as our living room. When you walked through the front door, there was a staircase immediately to the left, which went up to a hallway that turned right. In the hall, there was a bathroom, and my room was at the very end. There were 2 other rooms on the right side as well. At the time, I had 3 roommates, a girl who lived across the hall and a guy who lived in the other room upstairs. There was also another guy in the downstairs area. All of them were usually gone on the weekends though. On the night in question, I was dating my girlfriend for a little over a month. It was Saturday night, and I'd picked her up in my car. We went out, had a few drinks, and took an Uber home. I didn't feel comfortable driving. We got to the house and went immediately upstairs to my room. We were the only ones there. After me and my girlfriend had some intimate time together, we fell asleep. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but my girlfriend is not. All of a sudden, she nudged me awake to tell me she had heard a noise coming from outside. I told her it was probably just some drunk people walking by since we lived so close to campus. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other small animal. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and tried to go back to sleep. Just then, though, we heard another noise coming from the back of the house. It didn't sound like people just walking by. This time, I got out of bed and walked over to one of my windows, which faced the area the noise was coming from directly. I had the curtains and blinds down. I peeked from around the corner and looked outside. My slight buzz and drowsiness went away immediately. My heart started racing like crazy after I looked outside and saw the silhouette of a person climbing onto the roof of the extension. My girlfriend saw my reaction and asked me what was wrong. I immediately told her to grab a phone and go to Jessica's room across the hall, lock the door, and call 911 because there was an intruder climbing the roof of our house. My girlfriend did as she was told. I slipped on a pair of gym shorts and shoes and grabbed a kitchen knife that was on my desk, left over after eating some dinner and conveniently forgetting to clean it up the night before. How lucky for me. I stood next to the window with my back against the wall and listened in closely. I could hear the person walking along the roof, leaving light footsteps. Then I heard a noise. I could tell he was fidgeting with the bathroom window, which was right next to my room. Luckily, that window was already locked. I tiptoed outside my room into the hall, waiting to attack if he broke in through the window, knowing I had to protect my home and my girlfriend. I stopped hearing the noises coming from the bathroom window. Then I started to hear a similar noise coming from my window, the one I'd just been standing next to. My heart was pounding really hard now. I gripped the knife tight in my hand, mentally rehearsing on what I would do if they managed to break in. All of this occurred within just a few moments. I realized that maybe I could just scare the intruder away and avoid a confrontation completely. I took a deep breath and yelled, "I have a gun! Come inside and find out!" I heard the thud of footsteps going away from the window, and then the noise of gravel. I was sweating at this point. I walked outside my room and knocked on Jessica's door, telling my girlfriend it was me, and the intruder seemed to be gone. She unlocked the door and opened it. I saw she had been crying. I dropped the knife and hugged her. I told her everything was going to be okay. Just then, I saw the blue and red lights of the police outside the window of Jessica's room, which faced the front of the house. I told my girlfriend to come with me so we could tell the police what happened. I walked downstairs, turned on the porch light, and unlocked the door, opening it slowly with my hands held up. The police were approaching with their guns drawn and saw me in nothing but shorts and shoes drenched in sweat. I kept my hands held up and told them I lived there and the intruder had ran away out the back. The police officer said something into his radio, some code or something. He said the intruder was still on the loose. He stood there with us while the other officer walked inside the house. I was told he was going to check and make sure there was no one hiding inside or something. After what seemed like a long while, but was maybe only a few minutes, I heard a voice over the radio calling it all clear. We went inside, and one officer began to ask us questions, while the other poked around outside. After giving our statements, the other officer walked back in and told us it looked like the intruder had climbed on top of our garbage cans to get onto the roof. One of the cans was apparently tipped over. Since the house was dark and there was no light outside and no cars in the lot, we may have been victims of an attempted robbery. I asked the officer if there was any weapons they might have left behind in their startlement. He said no. It was unlikely the intruder wanted to harm anyone. There had been a series of break-ins during the last several weeks around campus, with the intruders mainly only taking prescription drugs. He advised me to get a better weapon than a steak knife for the future, and to keep the lights on inside and our windows locked, maybe consider installing outside lights. I asked if he could fingerprint the window, but he said he couldn't because nothing had been taken and no one was harmed. Most likely this person had been wearing gloves anyway. The police told us they would have units search the neighborhood, but it was unlikely they would find the person, since I couldn't give a description of them, having only seen a silhouette. Needless to say, my girlfriend and I did not get much sleep that night. The next day, I called my landlord and told him what happened. The following day, we had a bright light installed on our back patio that turned on when it got dark automatically. We also installed a motion light outside the window upstairs that shines brightly if anyone tries to stand on the roof. Not content on just threatening a burglar with a gun, I went out and actually bought one. I now keep it in my nightstand drawer beside my bed. This happened after my hunt for some white-tailed deer in northern Michigan. I was leaving the woods and heading back to my car for the long ride home. The sun was setting and the air was crisp. The smell of fall was in the air. As I got to my car, I heard some rustling in the brush on the other side of the trail I was parked on. Thinking it was an animal, I looked across, only to see a man standing there. He was kind of swaying from side to side. Not a drunk-type sway, mind you, but more an impatient standing in the line for a long time type of sway. I called out to the man. Maybe he might need help or something. "Hey man, you lost?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gave me the creepiest smirk and tilted his head back slightly without taking his eyes off me. Needless to say, I was creeped the fuck out by this dude. My guns had made me feel protected, but as I'd loaded my pack and shotgun into the car already, I couldn't take my eyes off him. He kept his locked on mine. Luckily, I'd kept my 9mm on me, just in case he tried something. I was parked parallel to the trail, so when I got into my car, I could still see him. I drove off feeling unnerved and checked back in my mirror. He was in the middle of the trail, just running in my direction. That was the creepiest day of hunting I ever had. I was in Denali National Park 2 years ago with my now wife and 2 other friends. If you aren't familiar with it, it's a trailless wilderness. That means there aren't any trailheads or marked trails. If you find social or game trails, you're encouraged to avoid them to keep the wilderness as pristine as possible. You're given a backcountry permit to a unit, which is a large division of the park which has a limited number of campers allowed on it. You get on the bus that goes to the one road through the park, and it drops you off when it's going through your access to your assigned unit. Then it drives away, leaving you in the middle of nowhere. It's amazing and intimidating at the same time. Anyway, we were backpacking for 2 amazing days, but we had yet to see any wildlife other than the local ptarmigans. On the morning of the last day, the others were drinking coffee and we were preparing to break camp. I'm looking down in the river valley that our campsite has a good view of. We hadn't seen any other humans for 48 hours. I thought I could see some campers hiking through the brush in the distance. I called out, only to have the hiker turn out to be a gigantic bear who popped up his head and looked right at us. We started watching him as he walked along the river and slowly made his way towards our camp. "He's not coming up here," I said to the group. Well, he was. He climbed up the hill and walked right into our campsite. We gave him a wide berth as he approached, and froze as he eyeballed us for a while. He then continued on up the side of the mountain. It was scary as hell, but he was majestic as fuck as well. Anyway, it started to pour on us. We finished breaking camp and decided to save some time by following a game trail for a bit, as we were now soaked and quite cold. This saved us a lot of time bushwhacking through alders and whatnot. Well, we rounded a corner, and the trail came to a dead end in what was the remains of a recent bear kill site, bones of a moose, flattened down brush, old scat. Let me tell you, it was an unnerving feeling. We froze as the blood drained out of our faces. We looked at each other and instantly agreed to double back a bit and start our bushwhacking anew to get the hell out of there. I was doing an overnight in a nearby nature preserve, testing out some new gear. I'd hiked that place many times and knew it quite well. I chose a spot a little too close to the water, however, and being Michigan in the summer, dusk brought many mosquitoes. All the mosquitoes, I'd imagine. I made a small, punky fire that kept them at bay, but once I put it out and turned in for the night, those sharks came cruising in. I tried to stick it out, but by 0 dark 100, I got the fuck out of Dodge. It was a really lovely night, though. Clear sky, full moon. It was nice having the forest to myself. Except I didn't. I was walking a trail below a ridgeline when I could sense something keeping my pace above and a bit behind me, just to the left. When I walked, it walked. When I stopped, it stopped as well. The area was too densely wooded to make out anything by just moonlight. I could hear the sound of it moving, very light steps, an occasional leaf or twig cracking. I've got pretty exceptional hearing and smell, but there was a hole where I thought it should have been. If it were a predator big or bold enough to stalk me like that, I had a strong feeling that taking off on a run would have made it give chase. So I simply walked. For miles, this thing tracked me down. I think that was the first time I ever had cold sweats, just trying to remain calm and not give in to the flight urge. After a couple of hours, I got near the entrance of the park, close enough that you could make out the ugly yellow of the sodium lights near the main road. Around about then, I noticed that whatever was there left as I approached the light. It let me exit the park unmolested, but I had a new respect for the things that go bump in the night. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, Please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.